we'll have it open. Then we'll have it open for other Q&A until 1:30.
And our moderator for today is Laura Berger. So Laura, do you want to take it away?
Yes, sure. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. My name is Laura Berger, and we've got a great group of panelists here today across the board in terms of the committees that they work on, and also across industries. And so what we'd like to do is the format of it is we're gonna, have a couple questions. Michelle is gonna, kick off that first question. But before we even get into those questions, we're just gonna do a quick introduction of everyone so that you can get a basic understanding. So if we can start off with Brenda to just share a little bit about, your current boards that you're sitting on, the years of service, your areas of expertise, just a high level, not a deep dive. That
Sure.
would be great.
Sure, happy to do so. Hi, I'm Brenda Freeman, last 30 years or so, I've pretty much been at the intersection of brands, technology, and culture. So I was an engineer by trade and a marketer, and spent about 30 years or so in like C-suite roles in media, gaming, digital marketing, and an advisor for startups and things like that. So in terms of my board experience, starting in 2013 was my first public board. And since then, I've been pretty active on boards, depending on, the role that I had been at the time, full time. And now I'm in the sort of I don't know if I'd say semi-retired. I'd say I've got one foot into the chapter 2. The experience I've had so far has been both micro, mid cap, as well as large cap companies. So nice to meet everybody.
Maritza?
Hey, good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. So by way of background, I'm a CPA. I started my career at Deloitte, and I stayed there for 39 years in a number of different roles. I started out as an audit professional, worked my way up through the partnership, spent a few years doing what auditors do. And obviously a lot of you know what that is. I then moved into more of management roles, and my career path took me to Washington, D.C., where I spent about 12 years. Ultimately, I moved to New York and then back to D.C., where I ended my career. I spent 39 years at Deloitte. I retired as a deputy CEO of Deloitte, which is a hodgepodge of all kinds of different roles and things that I did. And since retiring from Deloitte, I serve now on 4 public boards. And I started that in 2015. One is Comcast, NBC Universal, which a lot of you probably are familiar with. If you have internet disruption, please don't get mad at me. But also I'm on the board of Royal Caribbean, the cruise line company. I'm on the board of McCormick, the flavor company. I hope you use their products every day. And I'm on the board of Aptar, which is a packaging company. I'm sure you probably have used a lot of their products, but don't know them by name. It's a lot of work. And I'm also on the board as a volunteer for a fairly large regional healthcare system based here in Miami, which used to be a client when I lived in Miami, which is where I live now. But I'm happy to share any experiences with you. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Eileen.
Okay. So I actually am happy to meet everybody. I've met some of you, and my background is that I'm the retired chair and CEO of Ingredion, which was corn products. We were a $6 billion company in the Chicago area. I'm a Floridian now, but I kind of split my time. I have 1 child in Chicago, 1 in Florida. And so Ingredion, we increased the market cap from like 2 billion to almost 10 billion, or 5-fold. So very successful. And I only retired maybe 3 years ago from the company in 2018. So it might have been a little bit 4 or 5 years ago. And I've been on boards it's greater than 20 years, but less than 30. So when Brenda was talking about that, I was like, oh my God, how many years? So the mid 90s. And I've actually been on 9 different boards. And I was the first female on 5 of them. And many were in the Chicago area. Right now, I'm on 2 public boards, International Paper, where I've been what they call the presiding director or like a lead director, and I head up the governance committee. And I'm also on the board of Lockheed Martin in defense, and I've been heading up the comp committee, or what they call the MDCC, Management Development Compensation Committee. And it's been a great experience, and I can name the 9 boards. I was thinking about them, but for the sake of, I've been on IP since 2012. So it's almost 10, it's about 10 years, a little more. And Lockheed Martin since 2016, so it's less than 10 years. So happy to talk about those different issues. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you. And Michelle.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be a part of this panel. You know, they always say, you know, be careful of all the relationships you make because you'll run across them, you know, as you go through your lifetime. Eileen and I have known each other forever, it seems. When I first went to work at Baxter Lowe those many decades ago, one of Eileen's best friends and my best friend at work, we met each other through that mutual connection, and it has really been interesting to see how careers have moved over time and lives have moved over time. I spent most of my working career in Chicago, and also have a lot of connections through that. I currently, my career is more focused on corporate governance and has been that for many years. I started out my career as in finance and strategy in a healthcare company in Chicago, went to run their largest international business in 1988, back way before a lot of women were given roles as CEOs of divisions and subsidiaries of corporations. So that was the beginning of my career, but it also allowed the beginning of my corporate governance career. Because shortly after that, a year after I went into that role, I got my first corporate board seat with the old Dayton Hudson Corporation, which is currently Target. And I was a part of that, which I was really pleased about because Target has an incredible governance structure. And early in being a part of that organization and that board, I got a really solid grounding in a lot of things that over the decades we've been talking about corporations needing to do from a governance standpoint. And so that's really been a terrific grounding for understanding what corporate board members should do and can do and have the possibility to do. And so that has been a major part of my career going forward. I have served on a number of corporate boards, both nationally and globally. I have currently sit on the board of United Airlines and United Health Group. At United Airlines, I chair the audit committee. United Health Group, I'm lead independent director. In both instances, airlines and healthcare, it was extremely interesting to go through those 2 boards and a pandemic. And so I'd be glad to talk about what boards have done and how we have reacted as we've gone through major crises. And I've served on, use that experience to help me as I am vice chair of a Smithsonian National Board, which is what I call my fun board. A lot of work, but a terrific opportunity to give back.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. And now that all the panelists have introduced themselves, you know, my role in working with many of you that are here today is really what Michelle just said in terms of what boards should and can do and what their management teams can do. And so that's the work that we do overall. So with that, we're going to dive into what really is going on in the boardroom. So Michelle, I'll have you kick us off. I'm going to share with you this question. the board is there to provide oversight of strategy execution and risk management. How do you differentiate the board's role versus management's role, specifically in regards to strategy development?
You know, this, to me, this question is framed in the right way because it's specifically focused on board oversight. That is our role. Our role is not to manage the company. Our role is not to micromanage the executive team. Our role is to provide oversight. And through that oversight, in my opinion, the best thing that we can do is share our experiences and also share our understanding, because again, I think being a director is a profession. So you should be looking at your, whatever board you sit on, as a profession, learning the industry, learning the competitors, understanding the impact of environmental risk, et cetera. You should be able to use that whole portfolio of tools that you bring to your board seat to ask questions and to, I call it, nudge the organization through your questions to expand and develop and change the strategy when necessary. Our role is not to make the strategy. Our role is to advise and to develop and to provide our input so that the strategy moves in a certain direction. That's what you have a CEO for, is to actually bring those strategy and the alternatives to that strategy to the board so that the board can discuss that and to help through their questions and through their direction in the boardroom, help the management team to clearly understand where they're going well and where they might need to spend more time and really, dig down deep into certain areas because perhaps they haven't looked at it through the same lens that somebody else on the board has. I think that as we can all attest through even the last couple of years, things are constantly changing. The amount of risk, the geopolitical risk, the technology. Who the heck would have even heard of ChatGPT, which just came out in November, but is having such a strong impact and future impact on what is going to happen in a lot of professions and a lot of companies. We as directors, through our oversight role, need to use that to bring to the boardroom and bring to our questions and bring to our discussions with management, and hopefully having those discussions at every meeting on some aspect of strategy and risk through both the board and the committees, so that we are able to, again, all agree that either we are going in the right direction or there are things we need to really understand and perhaps change or impact the direction that we are going.
Great, thank you. Eileen, I see your
Yeah,
hand up.
I agree with Michelle, but the board's role, while it's oversight to strategy, you're endorsing it. So people need to know that the board is, while you're trying to influence management with your experiences, you're also approving it. So, and that's an important role. And the other
Agreed.
important role I would say is CEO selection and of a board, and that is a challenging, depending on the industry, inside, outside. There's a lot of issues that we talk about that. But as it relates to strategy, I think it's important to know that the board has an approval implicit. It may be explicit where you vote. It may be implicit that you're listening to it, but you're trying to influence management. And we know firsthand that strategy is an important component of the board role.
Thank you, Eileen. That, what both you and Michelle are referring to in terms of the role of the board of oversight moves us very nicely into, we hear the term nose in, fingers out all the time. Okay, so there's oversight and we hear the term nose in, fingers out. How does that really play out in the boardroom? Brenda?
Hi. So it was a good tee up, actually, what
Yeah.
Michelle and Eileen said, but I will counter a tiny bit that things have changed significantly over the last 5 years in terms of where that line is, in terms of nose in versus fingers out for some of the reasons that Michelle talked about in terms of how quick things are moving. So, currently and for me, a lot of this experience is, and my reference points are the fact that small early stage companies tend to have a very different line than companies that are legacy companies that have been established and have sustained a level of sort of like, I guess you could say, results that are predictable. But I would say that, the idea of, it's a popular adage, right, that most directors say that we are there to, basically govern. But the overall risks, the art of the question, those are the things that in 2013, young directors, you would sit back and sort of learn how to do that in a way to not feel as though you were crossing that line and going into the management, side of things. And each company also has very unique cultural norms. There's some companies that I, have sat on the boards where they sort of expect, a lot more lean in versus lean out. But I would just say, frankly, all of the directors are being tested, right now in terms of where that line is, particularly if the company or the industry is going through a form of either radical transformation or some form of crisis. And I would say, based on what's happened with COVID and the acceleration of so many things like cybersecurity, DEIB, just overall ESG, that there are, the overall speed of change and the amount of risk that are put on directors. It's a lot, it requires a lot more in terms of nose in.
Yes. Yeah.
So nose in, fingers out at your own peril.
Yes. And Brenda, that has been our experience in working with management teams and boards. There is that fine line, and there's kind of a rub that goes on in managing that fine line, especially around crisis. It just makes me think of what just occurred last week with SVB. And there was a lot of conversation around, okay, well, what's the board's responsibility in this?
Right.
So that's something to really take note of in terms of risk.
I mean, I'm lead independent director for a company, but I'm also, I just recently had to chair a technology committee. It's the very first time that the board has actually even, and this is 100-year plus old company, that decided that, the capital level of capital investment that's going to be taking place over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years or so, are so significant, on the back end that are tied to customers, that they decided that it made sense to actually have extra level of oversight, / governance in the technology side. So you find that that's another proof point, if you will, of how the world's changing for directors. Anyway, sorry, Laura, I don't.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Moving right along, back to that comment around CEO selection and the board's responsibility around CEO selection. Obviously, one of the board's primary governance roles is CEO assessment. So you've selected and now you're assessing. Maritza, can you please kick off the discussion around what that entails as you're moving through that type of assessment?
Yeah, so a lot of this hard work comes through what's the compensation committee of every board, which I have the pleasure of serving on. I'm now just on audit committees, and audit committees are a lot of work, but more and more compensation committees are also a lot of work. The SEC just issued the Say on Pay new guidelines, and so it's also an area where activists and people in general just are interested in. So I would say that in terms of CEO and all the top 5 executives and executives as a whole, that you have a very, very structured process in which you undertake the identification of what are going to be the goals and metrics under which that are important to achieve shareholder value, thinking through your umbrella of that. What are the goals that are going to drive that success? What are the metrics? What are the weighting? Bearing in mind that what you want to do is balance the short-term goals with creating long-term value. And so basically compensation and performance is established way ahead of the game, where you establish, what's important, for example, metrics around revenue growth, gross margins, EPS, and anything else that you think is important to the success of the organization. I think Boeing, for example, I read a few weeks ago that did not pay a bonus to the CEO because they couldn't get that 777 approved. And I thought that was a very precise way of garnering the importance of that to the overall health and wealth and performance of the company. So essentially, you go through the process of, what are the short-term goals? There are goals that are set 3 to 5 years, sometimes a little bit longer than that. And so it's quite a process that you go through, but the performance really comes back to, how did you do against those metrics? Because the metrics are well thought out. There's also a peer group analysis that you undertake of companies that are in comparable industries, but also in comparable size and complexity. So if you're just in the US, you want to compare yourself to US-based companies. But if you're global, you want to compare yourself to companies that are your competitors and your peers, because a lot of companies really have perform services or provide services in different kinds of industries. So you want to peer yourself against that, because the talent pool from which you hire is from that same area. So I would say, COVID, I think several of the colleagues of mine that are on the panel have talked about how COVID changed everything. So COVID did change everything. There were a lot of companies that flourished through COVID, had their issues were keeping up with demand and supply chain disruptions, and they couldn't keep up. And so they had huge revenue growth, huge impact on margins. It was just a phenomenal year. And then you had other companies that had liquidity crisis. And it was survival of the fittest. And you had to really go back and look at the goals that you established a while ago as to CEO performance and metrics, and really kind of tweak that into new metrics of performance that were fair to both the talent of the company, the CEOs and the leadership, as well as what's fair to the employees and the stakeholders, as well as what's fair to shareholders. There's this, I encourage all of you to go to the disclosures and proxies, because you get a lot of information. And proxy advisors are very, very active in kind of giving you their 2 cents worth around this as well. And so you monitor all of that. But I would say that it's, for the most part, except for the challenges of COVID, it works very, very well and very smoothly.
Great, thank you. Michelle, you and I had we had a little conversation around underperforming CEOs and how a director moves through that scenario where you have to exit someone.
Yeah, I think you figure out that you have to exit somebody by that evaluation and assessment process. Because a CEO, yes, is clearly responsible for all of the financials and all of the performance metrics that Brenda was talking about. So I totally buy into that. But the other thing that they are responsible for, and is, most clearly, is setting the culture and defining the behaviors that are acceptable within an organization. When they talk about, where was the board and why wasn't the board on top of things, and, things are culture related. The board, I forget who said it, but the board hires the CEO. So you get the culture that CEO puts into your organization, overlays onto it. Sometimes things work out with a CEO, sometimes they don't. Unfortunately, I've been involved over my almost 35 years in board governance with situations where we have had planned retirements and planned exits from our organization and fabulous CEOs, and other times when we've had missteps and have had to have unplanned succession. The issue to me from a director's perspective is being willing to step up and truly understand when things are working and when they aren't. And my boards typically use executive sessions to have those discussions. And usually if things are beginning to go off the rails, somebody's going to mention it in executive session. And they're going to say something about, either the missteps or things that they're hearing within the organization where the organization is beginning to question the leadership of the CEO through one aspect of it or another. And you have to listen hard in those conversations. And it's not something that you talk about 1 month and 4 months later, you're ready to pull the trigger. In most instances, it is something that you watch, you provide feedback, you see if that feedback gets acted upon, you work with the individual, and taking a decision to exit a CEO truly, truly, truly is one of the hardest decisions that I've ever made in my business career. It's not something that is done lightly. It is not something that's done because of one aspect that you think is not working. It is a very, very, very difficult decision.
Yes.
But the better board members are willing to step up and make that decision and to take that hard decision and decide that, yes, we may love you in these aspects, we don't love you so much in these others, and it's time for us to make a change. And that to me is the real challenge of a board is, are they willing to make that tough decision?
And that, and what Maritza and Michelle, you're talking about really does tie. I like this theme of walking a fine line, because as you are, assessing and evaluating a potential exit of an underperforming CEO, you do want to make sure that you have a very good pulse before making any rash decisions, because it is a very difficult process to do. And it takes, we've had clients in scenarios where you have 2 new board members coming on and are wanting to really see what the CEO can and cannot do, and a little hesitant to make that call. And it's the responsibility of the board collectively. A better board, better directors are going to say, look, let us get you up to speed, because that can be detrimental too, of we took too long. Well,
and there are other instances in which a board, and I've been on these kinds of boards as well, where we will delay bringing on a new board member, and if we are far along the pathway of having this question about whether or not the CEO will remain with us or not, we will delay bringing on a new director until we think we've resolved in our minds of the current directors whether or not we want to move forward, or whether or not there needs to be a change.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's
Right.
one other comment. I also think that CEO succession is the board responsibility. So to the extent
absolutely.
if something that is not working with the CEO, you got to step back and you got to look at, how did we get here to begin with? And do we have others that are on the bench that are ready, perhaps to an internal candidate that is really ready to take over the role? But, you should go back. If something didn't work right, you should go back to assess, how did we get here? Because it takes years to develop a CEO candidate. And sometimes you have to go to the outside because you don't feel like you have the right candidate on the inside, which is a challenge as well, because it's very disruptive and you quite never know exactly what you're getting. Having said that, going through a smooth CEO transition, which I've had the fortune of living two of those recently, but I've had the misfortune of living through one that didn't go as well as, and so you learn from your experiences. And I will tell you that focusing on it as a board is one of your most primary responsibilities. And one of the things that can really disrupt value creation instantly because of decisions that a CEO abruptly exits, or there's a not just a performance issue, but there's character issues and other issues which go to the culture of the company, which I think, Eileen, you talked about. So there's many factors involved, but the board does have that responsibility as well. So it's a kind of a balancing act.
Absolutely. Yes, Eileen.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I agree with both Maritza and Michelle on their comments. I would say the big issue right now is separating the role of CEO and independent chair. And there are some proxy resolutions pushing that one way or another. There was last year. I think there are this year. And I think there's also another big issue, which is the age of the CEO. We talk about assessment and succession. And a lot of companies have a 65 age, and that may not be the right age. Several companies are considering a higher age, because 65 is the new 55 is the old 65. But it's a matter of the team, and sometimes some companies have officers that can't be over 65, and you have to decide that as a board member. So it's important that you're involved in that. That's related to CEO assessment. It's related to CEO succession. And you have to decide all that as a board member. So you're very involved in that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And Eileen, we're in the midst of proxy season. So
yeah,
what's going on? Share
I've been
about
thinking
that.
about that because some of my proxies have been filed. One is for my board, it will be filed next week. So I'm thinking about that a lot.
Yeah.
And I've been reading proxies, and I know my fellow panel members are also reading those. We've talked about that. And, I give Maritza a lot of credit for being on 4 boards, because I was on 3 and it was hard to keep up with all the issues. So 2 is a definite can work. The question is, you can be on up to 5.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this, that it's hard. So you got to think about that. But I think when I was thinking about, so proxy season is important to make sure that what it says is the comp committee, the CD&A is very important for the board to be aligned with, as well as the entire proxy, which has not just the compensation discussion, but also has the resolutions that shareholders have pushed. And so we have to make sure as board members that we're aligned with all that, and that you jump in and make changes for management if you see a change that's needed. And I always say to people, it's better to do it before you go to press, because it's expensive if you go to press. And it can be done before it's mailed out, but it is very expensive, and management pushes back. And so I think that it's very important to look at all that, decide on the number of boards that you think you can handle. And so, because it's a lot of work. And so I tell people, you probably want to think about, as I said, 2 boards, 3 boards, 4 and 5 is hard. And that's why I give Maritza the credit. And private boards, the dates are more flexible, but there are requirements that people say to me, well, 2 public boards and 2 private can be doable, but I still think it's, we're very involved in all the decisions. And so you want to make sure that you're very attuned to all those.
So what can a new director expect moving into proxy season? Like, they're just coming in and they're new, and it's like, what can they expect?
Well,
hold on. I'm sorry, Eileen, I'm gonna call on
Okay.
Brenda because I see her hand. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, okay. And actually, I apologize, Michelle, because I think you raised your hand first, but just FYI, I'm also serve on 4 public boards. So I think it just, depends. Like the idea of thinking to, let's say, serve on 4 it's your first rodeo, the first 5 years, I think would probably be ambitious, but when you've been doing it since 2013, I'm defending you, Maritza. It's probably you've figured it out. And I'm sure you're not chairing all 4 of those boards. Like there's usually ebbs and flows in terms of the amount of time required, whether you're lead independent or whether you chair one of the committees like audit or whatever. But I was just going to say in general, the proxy season, the thing that for those that are very curious, that is really where all of the annual reporting, gets done. And so there's a lot of prep work ahead of time, particularly if you tend to serve on the nominating and governance committee. I happen to chair 2 of the 4 board meetings. So I've been very busy. And in general, the SEC, like the overall demands, if you will, of transparency with shareholders and investors has gone like that over the last, 3 to 5 years. There's lots of new rulings that have come out that we could probably go into. One of the ones in general is called Universal Proxy Card, which is a huge one because now not only does the company get to put their slate of directors up there, but anyone, can basically, add their own director candidates to the slate and they have to get voted on. Like that's a new ruling, which has caused a little bit of a seismic ripple, through all of the boards and the companies that I'm associated with. So there, that just the overall level of transparency, the amount of preparation to make sure that you're as buttoned up as possible, having super strong directors that attend every meeting, all this stuff is public. If you're on a public board, everything's public. A lot of things are accessible to the public. So making sure you don't have weak links, making sure that your governance, your charters are super tight, making sure your tenure's right, overall mix. There's associations, Glass Lewis and ISS, that basically give you ratings, and it's the sort of thing that boards look at very closely to make sure that they're doing everything right. So anyway, just the overall demands for proxy season have just continued to go up. Sorry, Michelle, maybe you were going to say some of that too.
Yeah, Michelle. You're on.
Yeah, that's okay, because the only thing I would add, and I agree with everything that you guys have been saying thus far, is that I don't think of proxy season. So there's this period of time in which we have to do the write-ups and, do all of make all of our decisions to get into the actual physical documents. But as a director, I like to think about that we need to be thinking about our decision-making all year long. Because whenever you have an issue, one, you need to understand your shareholders well enough that you know what issues are going to be hot buttons for them, and that you understand how those potential issues square with what you are doing within your board. And a lot of boards, most boards, I hope, have opportunities to have conversations with their key shareholders in what is called the off season. And so when it gets to be like right now, a lot of shareholders don't have time to be talking to you about your issues or how they plan on voting or whatever. They want to talk to you when they're not quite as busy. And so you have to make time and you have to understand those issues early in the year in order to understand what's happening, have those meetings with your key shareholders. If there are issues, try to figure out, if you're going to respond to them or not. And if you're not, what is your board's position going to be? You need to have all of those steps done before you get into the proxy season and get to the point where you're actually writing your documents. The other thing I would say is that this thing about the universal proxy card that you brought up, Brenda, is not a small issue. And we as directors need to clearly understand that the ability of I'll call them outsiders, if you will, others who either are activist investors or maybe even some of your shareholders are going to be able to, with limited cost and with equal opportunity, provide their candidates mixed in with the board's candidates. And so there's no, this is us and this is them, which is going to make it all the more challenging for the board's slate to get approved if indeed there are others that are involved on that universal proxy card. You can get a hint of that if you do all of this advanced work so that you understand where your shareholders are, where your investors are, and what issues might come to play. You don't want to hear about these issues at the last minute.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes. Eileen.
Yeah, I just was going to say, no, I agree with Michelle. I think the other thing people have to realize that during proxy season, you cannot ask for a vote. So the governance, the general counsel is very important to listen to. I know this because I spoke to a shareholder earlier today for one of my boards. I was there as a presiding director. And so it's very important to know what the rules are. And so maybe you're right, Michelle, that in the off season, you could discuss their vote, but in the proxy season, you cannot. So people have to realize that. And so I think the proxy season, the other reason I was thinking about that season is because, you know, I give Brenda credit for being on the public boards, but I was on 3 management development, 3 comp committees, and it was a lot to remember. And so that in the comp committee, you hear the proxy advisors, what they're looking at, ISS and Glass Lewis, and they're the ones that kind of give a view on how many boards that you ought to be on. So they're very important to read those reports, to be involved in that as a board member, to know. And so during proxy season, the comp committees approve the CD&A of the proxy, the compensation discussion and analysis, and then the entire board votes on it, normally in March. So as a board member, you have to be available for those times. And so that's it, one of the difference between on season and off season, to know that.
Thank you very much. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, and then we're going to move into questions from the participants. And we're going to start with Brenda.
Actually, Laura, before you get these next round of answers, want to encourage our participants to start posting questions in the chat, and so that we will have their questions to address.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And let me turn it back to you. Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's perfectly fine. So Brenda, can you share one competency that's important as a director and why?
Yeah, the one that can get folks tripped up, I think, the most, it's not the great dents in the helmet, the experience, functional expertise, that sort of thing. I would say it's having high EQ, knowing how to, basically understand what the behavioral norms are, of that particular company, of the cohort of board directors. They, the chair sets the tone too, in terms of what that culture might be for the board. So just being able to have EQ and being able to create really strong, trusted relationships amongst your board peers, as well as the management team. I'd say that's a big one.
Right, great. Maritza.
Sorry, I wasn't able to find my button to unmute it. I agree with that. I think intentful listening is a skill that you need to develop. And what do I mean by that? All of us in life are distracted by cell phones and multitasking and Zoom calls and getting calls on your cell phone. And I actually think that being present, going well prepared so that you're not asking a question that was in the pre-read material. But I think intentful listening And I think your job is to seek to understand, but also be thought-provoking. So I think having some sense of curiosity, and of course, you need subject matter expertise. You need a board that sort of takes all the skill sets that you need to have in a boardroom to be able to provide the right level of advice and counsel. You got to earn the trust and respect, but in my opinion, if you've got the right, you're going to spend a lot of time with these board members. So make sure that you are a cultural fit for them and they for you. But I think once you gain the mutual respect by spending time together, and you'll spend a lot of time together, I think the trust will develop. And I think it's important that even though an area, for example, cyber might get delegated to the audit committee, it's important as all board members because it impacts brand so greatly that everyone understand what's going on with cyber and what are the risks and what's being mitigated and so forth. But I think I go back to intentful listening. So seek to understand, be present in the moment, and be inquisitive. And I think the EQ part should not be understated. I'm glad that you mentioned that. So thank you.
Michelle, I know you were gonna chime in there.
I agree with both of those. My take would be to be additive is you need to, I think people need to treat being a director as a profession, something that you have to understand, even if you're on a board that is within your wheelhouse, so to speak. There are aspects of that business that you need to spend a lot of time trying to understand, get under your fingers, so to speak. Understanding the industry, understanding the competition, understanding the technology, really understanding this so that as you begin to think about strategy and risk and those elements moving forward, you can bring something to the table. Most of the boards I've served on have been outside of what I call my home experience, which is healthcare. But because I've treated my experiences as a profession, I go in there and I learn about airlines and transportation. I've gone and I've learned about pharmaceuticals. I've learned about those things so that in my tenure as a director, I have become very well respected as somebody that understands and therefore asks intelligent questions in the boardroom. And that's, to me, the ultimate goal is to understand well enough so that you can ask intelligent and thoughtful questions, which I think is important to your role as a director.
Great, thank you so much. Eileen.
Yeah, what I would add is to those competencies, which I agree with, is being analytical. Because so much, whether it's audit or compensation or any of the committees, it does require that you can analyze data, whether it's the financials or trends or environmental ESG. You never know. So being analytical is very important in addition to intentful listening and EQ. So I would say that that's important. I also agree with Michelle that you want to be able to learn an industry, and I'm big on plant tours. There's nothing that replaces asking for that early on. And I will tell you that one of my boards was able to do that, and another board said, no, stay, we'll let you know when it's ready to take a tour. And it made a big difference. So I would push where it's appropriate. And we always say, you know, I'm saying being analytical. The other thing we look at with board members is you don't want to be, we always say, does that person have to be the smartest person in the room? Because a board is a team sport. And so you don't want people that are what I call just individual contributors. You are part of a team. And as Brenda said, you're going to spend a lot of time with everybody. So you are Maritza. So you want to make sure that that person who's joining the board is going to add value and have the right skills, but be a team player. And that doesn't mean that they can't think of something that isn't been said. That's important, but it's also somebody who just doesn't have to talk to hear themselves talk.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that they're not taking, that they don't need a lot of airtime.
Thank you, Eileen. And I think that also speaks to the responsibility of, the CEO is there to set the culture and define the behaviors. And as board member, taking that time and doing those plant visits does give you insight into what is the underpinnings of the organization. And it is the fine line that you're walking again of nose and fingers out, but absolutely critical to your role. Yeah. Well, excellent. We've got questions coming in. Yes, Sandy?
Yeah, and they're really thoughtful questions. So I would love to jump into them. Just a logistics thing for folks. We are going to keep this line open until 1:30. We do understand that we originally scheduled this as ending at 1. So if folks need to drop off, just go ahead and do that. But these are really thoughtful questions and I'd love to start tackling them.
And we'll turn off the tape at 1 o'clock also.
So I can go ahead and do that now. And should we just start at the top? And Lanya, if you want to, it's on your written house. If you want to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask your question, that would be great.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I had a couple of questions. I guess I'll go back reverse order. Have any of you turned down a board seat?